Hello, I'm Billy Stewart, Assistant Pastor here at Solid Rock Tabernacle, 1325 Rudy Road in Alma, Arkansas. Thank you for joining us for the broadcast. I'd like to extend this personal invitation for you to come join us in one of our spirit filled services. Our Sunday school begins at 9 a.m., our Sunday morning worship is at 10 a.m., and our Sunday evening worship is at 6 p.m. We also have an exciting Wednesday evening Bible study that begins at 7 p.m. Come join us, won't you? 1325 Rudy Road in Alma, Arkansas. Hey, we'll save a seat for you. And now, let's join our service already in progress.
Other than that, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. And okay. Okay. So let's remember all of them in prayer as well. It's been this last little bit has been rough, and they've got uh, two deaths from measles in Texas right now, and it's starting to go into New Mexico and other areas like that. So they're getting to be a measles outbreak now too. So let's remember that as well. All right. Anything else? Pastor, open us up. Amen. All right. And Riley. And Riley too. Yes, let's remember Riley too. All right. Last week we finished with Genesis. It only took us a year to get through it, but a little over a year to get through it, but we got through it. So now we're starting into Exodus. So let's start off with Exodus chapter 1. That's a good place to start, right? Chapter 1, right at the beginning of the book. Chapter 1, beginning at verse 1 and going through verse 6. So now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. For Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. So this reaches back, the first verse in this reaches back about 430 years. So it's starting, you start out, and the first verse is going back 430 years. And the story of Exodus basically picks up where the story of Genesis ends, right? It's a large family with a crucial place in God's plan of all the ages and their migration to Egypt. That's where we pick up at. We know at the end of Genesis, they were all wound up back in Egypt, and now we're going what's happening after all of that. Now, the Hebrew title for the book of Exodus is taken from the first words. And these are the names of. Okay? In the original language, the first word of Exodus is and, making it continuation, a continuity from Genesis into Exodus. So we're ending at the Genesis account where Joseph has died. We're going into the Exodus account. And the beginning of the Exodus account is telling all of the people that came into Egypt. Right? So Joseph was the remarkable great-grandson of Abraham. And he saved Egypt, the world for that matter, from the terrible famine that was happening. And he was able to do this because he listened to God's voice speaking through Pharaoh's dream. If you remember, we go back into Genesis, Pharaoh had a dream. And Joseph comes in and interprets that dream and says, okay, this is what it means. That's when Pharaoh put him in charge, made him prime minister, second in command of the country, and everything went from there. Joseph, for 7 years, there were 7 years of abundance. He saved up all the grain, got everything together. And then for the last 7 years, the 7 years of the famine, he was able to sell to other countries and keep the rest of the world alive. And because of his wisdom and administration, he was lifted to a high and honored office in Egypt. Yet eventually, we see Joseph died. And when Joseph died, the status that his family enjoyed died with him. You see, Joseph had the status. When he dies, that status goes away. And now his family, there were no birthrights and it wasn't like Pharaoh to where the first son got to take over as Pharaoh or as prime minister. No, when Joseph died, that was it. It was over. So when Joseph died, then his status, his family status, and they were being treated really good, if you remember, but his status their status got knocked down. Now, verse 7, and the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now, if you remember back in Genesis 4:27, it says, and Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. So we saw this in Genesis chapter 47, and it's now repeated. They're growing. They're multiplying. And they did continue to multiply generation after generation after generation, so that the land was filled with them. Now Egypt is getting more Jews, more Hebrews, than there are Egyptians. Right? Because they're multiplying real good. Remember, if they'd have stayed in Canaan, they probably would have been assimilated into the pagans. But since they're in Egypt and they were separated, because the Egyptians thought that they were so much better than everybody else, so since they were separated, they were able to flourish as a nation that way. Now remember, this family started out with 5 people when they were first come to Haran. Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Zilpah, and Bilhah. And it was blessed by God, the family of Israel grew rapidly in their years in Egypt. So as they were there, they got bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, here comes good part. Now there rose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Remember, up until now, the old Pharaoh was there, and he knew Joseph. So he basically was honoring the Hebrew people, the Hebrew children, because he knew them. Now there's a new king, there's a new Pharaoh, and he didn't know Joseph. And he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Means they outnumber us. Right? He says, come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Python and Ramesses. So, remember, the Egyptians were very proud. They were famous for their idea of racial superiority towards other people. In other words, you know, what they would call them today, white supremacists. But they were Egyptian supremacists. They thought that they were better than everybody else. Everybody else is inferior. They believed they were descended from the gods and everybody else was inferior and below them. Well, so it isn't surprising to see that they're afraid and discriminating against this strong minority group in their midst. You see, they were a minority group according to them, but there was actually more of them. And if the children of Israel had wanted to, they could have rose up against Egypt. But they didn't. Okay? But it didn't look like they were going to be a minority group for very long. At the time, the Egyptians were afraid of an invasion from the north of the Hittites. They were afraid the Hittites were going to come in and invade them. And what they feared the most is that if the Hebrews joined the Hittites, then it posed a significant threat to their security. When they came in, now would the Hebrews have joined with the Hittites? We don't know. If they were being treated good in Egypt, they may have joined with the Egyptians and fought against the Hittites. But the Egyptians had it in their mind, this group can join against us with our enemies, and they can defeat us. They can take us down. So, the Egyptians made slaves of the Hebrews. So, contrary to popular belief in the world today, slavery did not begin in 1619 in the United States. Hey, all the way back into the Old Testament, in Egypt, there were slaves. Right? So, when they were set to slave labor, they built a lot of great cities and monuments in Egypt. Now, they did not build the pyramids. There's a misconception that they didn't. The pyramids were built much earlier than when the Hebrews came in. Okay? But we don't know exactly when the Hebrew children were forced into slave labor. So, since we don't know when it happened, we don't really know how long it lasted. Now, there's some estimates that it was somewhere between 284 years, and others say that it was only 134 years. Either way, it was a long time, over 100 years. There's a famous wall painting on the ancient tomb of Thebes in Egypt, and it's the tomb of one of the overseers of brick-making slaves during the reign of Thutmose III that depicts the Hebrew children doing this. And you can see the slave masters, the taskmasters there above them with rods. And this is that painting that's there. So all these people that you see doing all this stuff, these are the Hebrew children that were doing that. All right, let's look at verse 12 and 14. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. Think about that. The more they came down on them, the more they grew. Yeah. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. Huh? Means that they were rough on them. They made them work hard. It was not, yeah, it wasn't going to work at Waffle House. It was hard work, okay? They were out there making bricks and building buildings and doing all this stuff. And if they didn't do it fast enough, they got beat. And, it was rough on them. Okay? But this was God's purpose for Israel in their time in Egypt. Basically what happened is Egypt served as a mother's womb for Israel. A place where they grew rapidly as a nation, and they basically grew from a large clan into a great nation. There are millions of them now. Remember, I said the nation wouldn't have been able to grow this way in Canaan. They would have been, it would have been practically impossible for them to avoid intermarriage with the pagans and the inhabitants of Canaan. And they would have basically just been assimilated into that whole culture. But Egypt was so racially biased and had such an entrenched system of racial separation that Israel could grow there over several centuries without being assimilated. In other words, the Hebrew children couldn't go and take an Egyptian wife, and an Egyptian man wouldn't take a Hebrew wife. Yeah, it's like water and oil. They wouldn't allow that to happen. Eh? As Joseph was more or less looked at as an Egyptian by that time. He was looked at lower than the Egyptians, but it was okay because he was second in command in Egypt. So even then, he was still considered lower in class than the Egyptian. Yeah. Yeah. One of those forced marriages. And it's interesting. You say it's interesting though because I've been looking over some medieval European, how the royalty came about and some of those places like that. And back then, you didn't get married out of love. When you got married, it was a transactional thing. Somebody that when this person in this royal family married somebody from this royal family, it was in order for them to increase their lands together. It wasn't a matter of love. They didn't love each other. Okay? So it was a transactional thing. And a lot of times, even with the more commoners, it was more of a transactional type of thing, too. Arranged marriages, you're going to marry Sally down the road. Well, I don't know Sally. It doesn't matter. You don't have to know Sally. You're still going to marry her. And if you don't like her, you're going to marry her. I gave her dad 5 goats for her, So, but that's the way marriage was. And it actually wasn't until like the 19th century, 1800s, early 1800s, before people actually, even in this country, started marrying for love. Because up until then it was always a transactional type of thing. Right? But Israel was able to grow over these centuries without being assimilated because they weren't able to intermarry with the Egyptian. And this growth in the face of affliction has consistently been the story of God's people. When you look back at it, as many times as they've tried to wipe out God's people, all the different dictators and people throughout the world have tried to wipe out God's people. They've never been able to do it. And they've always grown because of it. Right? So throughout the ages, the more they're afflicted, the more they grow. Yeah. Yeah. Except bears. Bears will kill you. So suffering and persecution are like a great wave that comes upon a ship, and it looks like it's going to destroy that ship. You know, anybody ever seen the Poseidon Adventure, where the wave comes over and tips the ship over and everything? And it's like that, but the ship catches the wave and uses it instead to kind of speed along. You know, if you catch a wave sideways, it's going to knock you over. But they tried these big ships, when they go into these waves like that, they always try to go straight into them or let it come into the back of them. If it comes into the back of them and they can get on it, it'll actually push them along a lot faster. It's like surfing. Imagine a big 1,000-foot long ship just surfing on the big wave down there. Okay? And it says they made their lives bitter with hard bondage. Because God's purpose was to bless Israel and fulfill his role for them in his eternal plan, no amount of affliction could defeat his purpose that he had. And the Egyptians tried their best through that cruel slavery, but it didn't work. The principle of Isaiah 54:17 proves true. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. The wickedness of the Egyptians could hurt the children of Israel, but it could never defeat God's plan for them. Okay? And Pharaoh at the time thought it best not to kill them. Okay? But he did want them to be slaves. And in the midst of this cruel and harsh service that they were forced upon, life probably seemed kind of hopeless to the Israeli children. And the idea of God working out his plan must have seemed like, no, that's pretty far away. Okay? And even though it seemed far away, and we get that way too sometimes, don't we? We go through hardship and problems and trials and tribulation, and we think in our life, I don't see what God's plan is here. I don't see how God is working in my life. I don't see how he's doing anything in my life. I don't see that there's a plan there. But the plan's there. Okay? Whether we see it or not, the plan's there. All right, verses 15 and 16. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and ye see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. All right? So, y'all understand what it means by being on the stools? Anybody not understand what? No? Okay, explain. You know how women have babies now? They lay them down in a nice antiseptic hospital and everything like that. Okay? In those days, the women had to stand on a stool like this, and that's how they gave birth. The midwife was standing there ready to catch the baby like a football. Boom. Okay. You know? So that's what it meant by when you see them on the stools. Okay. Now, we shouldn't expect that these two women were the only two midwives that the Hebrew children had. Remember, there's probably millions of them there now. So these are probably not the only two midwives for the children of Israel. They were probably the leader of some association of midwives. Right? Kind of like the American Medical Association. They were the leaders of all these midwives that were there. But the king of Egypt commanded them to kill all the male babies. Now this was to weaken and practically destroy the people of Israel within one generation. Because if you kill all the male babies, within a generation, you're not going to have any way to reproduce. Right? So we may see the command of Pharaoh as consistent with Satan's plan of Jew hatred throughout the centuries. Okay? We can look at this as an attack on God's Messiah himself and his ultimate plan for Israel and redemption. Why? Because Satan knew that Messiah was going to come from the children of Israel. So he tries to kill the whole nation in one generation by having all the male children killed. Okay? Now, verse 17. But the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. Now, the midwives, yeah, sure, they feared Pharaoh. They sure did. But they feared God more. And for them, the choice was clear. The civil government commanded something that was clearly against God's command. Now, we saw this a lot during COVID. Okay? The government tried to shut down churches, even going so far as there were pastors that were getting arrested in different places for having church services. Okay? And we keep hearing this. Anybody ever heard of the separation of church and state? Okay? Did you know that separation of church and state is not in the Constitution anywhere? That phrase, separation of church and state, was by Thomas Jefferson in the Federalist Papers. It's not in that. And what that is doing is, what he's talking about, the separation of church and state, is not saying that the church needs to stay out of government. It's saying the government has to stay out of the church. They never intended the church to stay out of government. As a matter of fact, they wanted the church in government. They wanted to make sure that there were godly people in positions of authority. Yeah, that's how it came about. You know, George Washington said, we call it his farewell address. It was actually a letter that he wrote to the colonies. They got published in the newspapers, but it was a letter that he wrote in a farewell address when he left the presidency. And he says, you can't have national morality apart from religious principle. And you can't. Just look at it now. They've taken religious principle out of the government, and they've done away with national morality. We don't have the national morality that was there is going away, but it's coming back. There are new surveys and new polls that are given that have been saying that the younger people, Generation X, or not Gen X, Gen Z, Gen Y and Gen Z, or whatever they are, Gen Z, I guess. Yeah, all the newer generation. They said they're starting to come back to church now. That these younger people are starting to be a revival in the movement of God, and these people are starting to come back to the church now. Okay? Which we knew this was going to happen. Jesus said that none of the things that he was talking about as far as end times was going to happen unless there be a great falling away first. Well, we're seeing the great falling away. Now we're seeing them being pulled back together. Joel 2:28 says, in the last days, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. So the people are starting to respond to it. But there had to be that great falling away first. And we're still seeing the result of a lot of that falling away. But it is being reversed. It is turning around. The tide is being turned. Okay? So, getting back to that, but the civil government commanded something that was just clearly against God's command. And we are not obligated. We're obligated to follow the rules of law, the rules of the land, the laws of the land. But we are not obligated to follow laws that go contrary to God's command. Right? We're not held accountable for that. If you if you drive down the road at 90 miles an hour on the interstate, I know some of y'all are going to be in trouble here on this. If you speed 90 miles an hour down the interstate, that's going against God. That's going against the laws of man. That is a sin. But if the government comes down and says you need to go out and kill all firstborn children, then no, it's not a sin to disobey that law. Okay? So what does not go against God's command and does not go against God's law is we have to follow. But if it goes against God's law, then we're not obligated to follow that. Right? So the midwives did the only right thing. They obeyed God rather than man. Okay? And like I said, though we're generally called to obey in the government and honor civic rules, we're never supposed to put government in place of God. And a lot of people have done that. You know, there's a lot of people out there praying that, you know, our Father who art in Washington. And no. Okay? So therefore, if a government tells us to do something against God's will, we are to obey God first, not man. All right. Verses 18 to 22. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, and that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. So, a lot of people assume that the Hebrew midwives lied to Pharaoh when they said this. But in all actuality, this may not be the case. The midwives may have actually told the truth. The Hebrew women were probably hardier than the Egyptian women. Okay? So, in other words, the Hebrew women didn't need the midwives to come in and help them deliver the babies. They were out there working. They were out there doing that stuff. The women be out there working, have the baby, pick it up, put it over her shoulder, and keep on working. They were hardier than the Egyptian women. Yet the midwives did not explain all the reasons why the baby were spared. So, God dealt with the midwives. And even if the midwives did deceive Pharaoh, that was not what God blessed, wasn't the deception. He blessed them, their godly bravery in obeying him, obeying God before man. Okay? The worse the persecution against God's plan to multiply the children of Israel, the more God made sure the plan succeeded. This is a wonderful example of the goodness and of the power of God. Pharaoh said less. God said, nah, more. Pharaoh said stop. And God said, nah, we're going to go ahead. If the battle was just between Pharaoh and the children of Israel, then obviously Pharaoh would have won, hands down. But the real battle included God in the equation, and that changed everything. And God obviously won this battle. But he won his victory through some courageous individuals who were willing to stand up to the power of Pharaoh. And stand up to him by doing what was right. It says he made them houses. This was God's blessing upon the midwives. In other words, he enabled them to have children of their own. Now, usually, midwives held that occupation because they couldn't have children of their own. And seeing that his plan didn't work, Pharaoh made a far more radical command, okay, that all male children should be killed. The method Pharaoh commanded for the death of the male children of Israel because the divine provision for training the deliverer became the divine provision for training the deliverer of Israel. That brings us to the end of chapter 1. Now, we're going to try to do chapter 2. Hopefully we got enough time. Not all of it. We'll get some of it on that. All right. Chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. And there went a man out of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. So the baby Moses came in and opened his eyes to a rather unfriendly world, to say the least. It reminds me of the little boy that was selling kittens. Did I tell you all that? Little boy was selling kittens at the Democratic National Convention. And he said, these people were coming out, and he says, Democrat kittens, get your Democrat kittens here. Kept trying to sell these Democrat kittens. A couple of weeks later, the Republicans had their convention in the same place. And people were coming out, and he was going, Republican kittens, get your Republican kittens here. And one reporter said, wait a minute. He was selling those kittens as Democrat kittens just a couple of weeks ago. So he went up to the boy and he says, hey, he says, weren't you selling Democrat kittens just a few weeks ago? And he said, yeah, I was. And he says, well, how are they Republican kittens now? And he says, well, now they got their eyes open. So Moses was born into a very, very, very unfriendly world. And he was born into a powerful nation, but he was a foreigner. And an opposed race during a time when all babies, such as himself, were under a royal death sentence. Okay? But Moses had something special in his favor. He was the baby of believing parents. Okay? Now, Moses was not the firstborn to his family. He had at least an older brother, Aaron, and an older sister, Miriam. Exodus 6:20 tells us the name of Moses' parents, Amram and Jochebed. There were fancifully Jewish legends say that Moses' birth was painless to his mother, and that at birth his face was so beautiful that the room filled with the light equal to the sun and the moon combined. And it says that he actually walked and spoke when he was 1 day old. Yeah. It said he refused to nurse. He was eating solid food from birth. Now, this is just Jewish legend. It's not anything on there. But so Moses' mother hid him for 3 months. Not just because of parental instinct. They did it also out of faith in God. Hebrews 11:23 says this, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. All right. Verses 3 through 6. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and laid it in the flags by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So, when you look at it in a literal sense, Moses' mother did exactly what Pharaoh said to do. Right? She put her son in the river. Eh? He didn't say how. He just said put him in the river. Eh? She just took care to put him in a waterproof basket. But she put him in the river. And she strategically floated him in that river. Now, this was a great example of trusting the child's welfare and future to God alone. So when Moses' mother let go of the boat made out of bulrushes, she gave up something precious. And she gave it up trusting that God was going to take care of it. And perhaps find a way to give it back to her. And in God's guidance, Pharaoh's daughter found the baby Moses. Now, she was conditioned in her upbringing, in her culture, to reject the Hebrews. But the cry of the baby melted her heart. It just touched her so greatly. God had this beautifully planned for the deliverance of both Moses and eventually for the people of Israel. He skillfully guided the parents of Moses, the current of the Nile, and the heart of Pharaoh's daughter to future his plan and his purpose to take care of things. Verses 7 through 10. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Okay. Using both the clever initiative of Moses' family and the need of Pharaoh's daughter, God arranged a way for Moses' mother to train him in the early years. Now, not only that, not only did she get to nurse him and train him and be the nanny for her own son, she also got paid for it. All right? So, God worked it out pretty good. But Moses became Pharaoh's daughter's son. And being the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, Moses was now in the royal family. Now, the Jewish historian Josephus wrote that Moses was the heir to the throne of Egypt, and that while he was a young man, he actually led the armies of Egypt into victorious battles against the Ethiopians. Certainly, he was raised with both the science and the learning of Egypt. Egypt was the most academic and scientific societies of the ancient cultures. And since he was out of the royal family, we expect that Moses could go anywhere. And when he went anywhere, he went on his princely chariot. Okay? Now when Joseph went back into Canaan to get his family? Remember what happened? He went with Pharaoh's chariots and all of this stuff, you know. I mean, he went with all the riches of Pharaoh. And now, here's Moses. When he goes somewhere, he goes how? With all the riches of Pharaoh. But we also know that Moses' Hebrew mother had an influence on his life. So he was certainly raised in the Hebrew heritage of his mother. Verse 11, and it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, and he looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting an Egypt, or smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So according to Acts 7:23, Moses was about 40 years old when this happened. Until then, he was trained and groomed, according to Josephus, to become the next Pharaoh. And while he was aware of his true origins because of his mother, Hebrews 11:24 and 26 tells us that some of what happened in the heart and mind of Moses as he looked at their burdens. Moses deliberately, at that time, he deliberately decided to identify with the people of Israel rather than the people of Egypt and of his Egyptian prestige and opportunity. It says, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasure of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Hebrews 11:24 to 26. See, Moses knew who he was. And as much as the allure and ease there was in the life of the Egyptian, it was his faith in God that helped him to know who he was. Because Moses had a heart filled with sympathy and brotherhood towards his people. And when he saw what was happening, he could not stand by while one of his fellow Israelites endured a beating. Verse number 12. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So Moses looks around first. Okay? He's like, what is that? That's the actions of somebody who knows what he's about to do. And he knows that what he's about to do is wrong. Okay? When you go in, when you see all this stuff that, people going in like they're shoplifting or something like that, they get stuff and before they slip it into their pocket or slip it into their purse or something like that. Okay? Why? Because I know what they're about to do is wrong. And I want to look to make sure nobody sees me do it. Okay? Now, Moses had several reasons for doing what he did. But his concern to hide what he did shows that he had a troubled conscience. And the Bible itself explains some of Moses' thinking behind his actions in Acts 7:23 to 25. Moses did this to defend and to avenge the beaten Israelite. But also with the expectation that his fellow Israelite would recognize him as their deliverer, just like Jesus. Moses could not deliver when he lived in the palaces of glory. Think about that. Moses knew that he wasn't going to be able to deliver the children of Israel as long as he was living in the palace. Jesus knew that he wouldn't be able to deliver the people from sin while he was living in glory in heaven. He knew he had to come down off the throne, away from the palace, and into a humble place before he could deliver his people. Okay? And we're going to end it right there. So we'll pick up at verse 13 next week. Any questions, comments, concerns, amens, omes? No questions? All right. In that case, Pastor?
Thank you for joining us today. We pray you were blessed by the broadcast. If you have a prayer request or questions about Solid Rock Tabernacle, please visit our website at www.solidrocktabernacle.org. That's www.solidrocktabernacle.org. On behalf of the pastors and congregation here at Solid Rock Tabernacle, we pray you have a blessed week, and we invite you to join us in person or on one of our future broadcasts.